Hey, everybody, you know I'm kind of a sales history nerd, right? Well, 100 years ago, there was something going on that I'd like to affectionately call the Great Salesperson Purge of the 1920s. And there's a reason why it's disconcerting. Here's why. 1919, so 103 years ago, it was said that sales executives, quote, took almost anybody into their sales forces. So incredibly high demand for salespeople, very low supply. Sounds familiar. Within about 18 months, the pendulum had completely swung. And by the end of 1920 into early 1921, quote, sales executives discharged practically all of their salesmen. 85% salesperson turnover in 1922, so that following year. So why should we be worried about that or disconcerted? Well, I'm not ringing the hear ye, the end is near bell, so don't get me wrong. But what's disconcerting is when you see the run up to it. When you see that in the 1910s, you had a period of steady economic growth, very similar to our 2010s. And then you saw a major disruption to the economy that caused a sudden and short term shrinkage or constriction of that economy. In 1917 into 1918, it was World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic. And here in March of 2020 was our own pandemic, right? And then after that was over, we saw a period of boom where there was massive growth, massive investment, high supply, or I'm sorry, high demand, low supply for salespeople. That was the case in late 1918 into early 1920. Very similar to late 2020 into today, to the point where there's over 700,000 sales roles available, according to ZipRecruiter. And that's outside of real estate, realtors, and car salespeople. So that's like real B2B jobs, over 700,000, not that much supply. And when you look at Crunchbase, I was crunching Crunchbase data around the number of newly minted unicorns. Don't you find it a little concerning, at least, that the record for newly minted unicorns took place in 2020, and that was 167. All right, remember that number, 167. The 4 years leading into the end of 2020, the total combined 4 years worth was 569 newly minted unicorns. How many did we have in 2021? 586. So the previous record, 167. And then in 1 year, 586. I call that a bit of a boom, right? Especially a technology boom. It's justified. We know why. Everybody had to go home. We needed to make tech investments to keep business running. Absolutely. But that was the same 100 years ago as businesses started to thrive, and we needed to take advantage of that period to maintain and grow ourselves as a world superpower. All right. So what happened? Well, a couple of things. First of all, good and bad salespeople were turning over during the boom. Sounds familiar. They were going and they were chasing money as companies were competing with one another to pay for that talent, whether it was good or bad, right? So higher costs of sales for the people that you did have, and that competition was driving turnover, which has a cost associated, right? High turnover, not good from a cost perspective. Companies then had to pass those costs off to somebody to maintain their profitability and to keep themselves in business. So they were driving those costs into their prices. Well, you had lots of companies doing the same things, right? Sounds familiar. I just saw a logo slide of sales and marketing tech stack where you can't even make out the logos because there's so many that are all doing the same thing. So what ends up happening? Well, there's not enough investment in technology. Back then, it was whatever the products are selling to go across to all the companies that were doing the same thing. So there was a leak and then a boom. And it created something called the Depression of 1920 and 1921. Now you think, well, Todd, the Depression was 1929 to 1933. That was the Great Depression. This was also a depression, which is considerably worse than a recession for those scoring at home. So 1921, 77% salesperson turnover. 1922, after the Depression was over, it grew. 85% salesperson turnover in 1922 as companies started to realize that they could go and be much more effective and profitable with smaller teams. They found out that the impact of smaller, high performing teams was better than huge teams that were medium performers. Who knew? And they created profitable, sustaining companies. Now, the reason I share this with you again is not to ring the bell that we need to be worried. We, as a profession, tend to not be very self aware. We tend to step on the same rake over and over again. And I think we all know that history tends to repeat itself when we don't know that history. Let's learn the lessons and look back at this and understand why it happened and how it happened. Because I think there are things that we can do right now to make sure that we are not overinvesting, that we're not chasing after bad salespeople, that we're setting proper expectations with all this funding that's going on, and to make sure that we don't suddenly pop the balloon that is clear from the Crunchbase chart where we are breaking records in terms of newly minted unicorns by 4x. What do you think? Am I crazy? Am I doomsdayer yelling at the clouds? Or is this possible? And should we be smart about it versus burying our heads in the sand and go, that could never happen today? Would love to hear from you. Would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks.